1 year ago, I was engaged to a woman I believed was the love of my life. Our relationship felt like the perfect love story, especially because she got along so well with my family. I had no clue what betrayal might lurk behind the scenes. My brother, who's just a year younger than me, had always been a bit competitive. He had a history of overshadowing me. From grade school awards to attention at family gatherings, I used to shrug it off as sibling rivalry. That changed drastically 2 months before our wedding, when I found them together in my bed. I still remember how surreal it felt when I opened the door. I'd come home early from a cake tasting appointment that got rescheduled. Instead of calling ahead, I thought I'd surprise my fiancée with a bouquet of flowers. I walked in quietly, eager to see her delighted face. Then I heard hushed voices and what sounded like stifled laughter. When I opened the bedroom door, my heart dropped. There, tangled in bedsheets I had chosen, were my brother and my fiancée. I must have looked like an apparition standing by the doorway, holding flowers meant to celebrate our upcoming union. I remember my fiancée's eyes widening, her mouth dropping open without any words. My brother scrambled to cover himself. Neither one looked at me with remorse. It was shock and fear, like children caught with their hands in the cookie jar. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply turned around, walked out, and slammed the door behind me. That might have been more terrifying to them than any scream. Something in me shut down, like a switch flipping. All those feelings, love, trust, hope, vanished in an instant. The wedding was off, and I told them both in a brief text. My parents found out almost immediately. They refused to believe it at first, but a single look at my face told them everything. My mother cried, ranting about how shameful it was to have this scandal in our family. My father tried to talk to my brother, but apparently, he was too embarrassed to come home. My ex-fiancée tried calling me, sending me messages, and even showed up at my workplace. I blocked her. I informed my boss about the situation so no one would let her in. I had no space for discussion. Their betrayal was the final straw. 2 weeks after the breakup, I learned she was pregnant. My mother wept with relief, thinking the baby was mine, and demanded I work things out. But I knew better. I confronted my ex-fiancée, and she confessed that the child was my brother's. My parents turned on my brother immediately, furious that he'd sabotaged our upcoming marriage. But he convinced them that he was in love and that they hadn't planned for this to happen. He also claimed he wanted to marry her out of responsibility. That only fueled my mother's heartbreak further, as she had to watch her family split. Despite the turmoil, my ex and brother actually went through with their own wedding. It was small, quick, and I wasn't invited. My parents were torn, but they attended because they felt obligated. They later told me it was one of the most awkward ceremonies they'd ever witnessed. My father didn't even give a toast. I was numb by then, focusing on my job and seeking therapy. I told myself I needed to heal, not dwell on revenge or bitterness, but that was easier said than done. The wedding photos they posted online reopened wounds I hadn't even realized were still raw. I distanced myself from the entire family. It hurt, but it was the only way I could think clearly. Therapy helped me process the betrayal, and I tried to rebuild my social circle. I poured myself into work and started hanging out with coworkers, some of whom eventually became close friends. Occasionally, my parents called to update me on my brother and his new wife. I didn't want to hear it, but they insisted, saying I was still part of the family. I told them that family doesn't do what he did, and I ended the calls as soon as possible. 7 months after their wedding, my brother vanished. He left a note saying he needed space and took off. No one knew if it was a midlife crisis, a job opportunity somewhere else, or simply a cowardly escape. His wife was heavily pregnant by then. My mother told me, sobbing, that they had no idea where he went. She tried calling me repeatedly, and when I finally picked up, she begged me to talk to my sister-in-law. She thought I could somehow convince him to come back, or at least offer some emotional support to the woman he left behind. I hung up. I was incredulous at how my parents could even think I owed this woman anything. She was the one who destroyed my trust and slept with my brother in my own bed. If anything, I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction knowing my brother had turned out to be just as unfaithful to her as he'd been disloyal to me. She had chosen him over me, and now she had to deal with the consequences of that choice. My parents thought I was cruel, but I viewed it as justice. I had nothing to offer them anymore. 3 months later, she gave birth to a baby girl. My brother was still nowhere to be found. My father tried everything, calling old friends, searching records, even hiring a private investigator. But no one could locate him. In the meantime, my parents expected me to step in, as if I were some replacement. I refused, ever reminding them that their loyalty had wavered when I needed them most. They argued I was punishing an innocent child for her parents' mistakes. I retorted that I'd paid enough for someone else's sins. This wasn't my responsibility, and I wouldn't let them guilt-trip me. My mother showed up unannounced at my apartment. She brought my sister-in-law and the baby, hoping I'd melt at the sight of my niece. I was polite enough not to slam the door, but I made it clear they couldn't stay. My mother demanded I at least hold the baby. The tension was thick, and my sister-in-law looked miserable. She apologized in a trembling voice, but I saw no remorse in her eyes, only desperation. She asked me to help her financially until my brother was found or until she could manage on her own. I refused. It wasn't my problem. When they left, I felt surprisingly empowered. For months, I'd been dealing with guilt because everyone implied I was cold-hearted. Yet the reality was that they'd stomped on my heart. Now they wanted me to pick up the pieces of a situation I never asked for. I decided it was time to protect myself fully. I blocked my parents' phone numbers for a while, ignoring their tearful voicemails. I ignored my sister-in-law's attempts to reach out through social media. I even moved to a new apartment without telling anyone. It felt extreme, but I couldn't handle their constant demands anymore. As time passed, I heard bits and pieces about my sister-in-law from relatives. She'd lost her job, was behind on rent, and had to rely on handouts from charities. My parents offered her spare rooms, but apparently she refused because of pride or tension. They still tried to contact me, pushing the narrative that I should help. I didn't budge. The more they pressed, the more convinced I became that this wasn't my cross to bear. In therapy, I finally stopped questioning whether I was a bad person. I realized I had a right to my boundaries and my anger. Then came an unexpected phone call from my aunt, someone who rarely meddled. She informed me that my sister-in-law had started hanging out with a sketchy crowd. There were rumors of substance abuse, and my aunt worried about the baby. She asked if I could step in to protect the child. I was torn. On one hand, I had no legal authority or moral obligation. On the other, there was an innocent baby in harm's way. My aunt suggested I report her to child services if I suspected neglect. I wrestled with the idea, but decided to wait for proof. Eventually, I heard from a mutual friend that my sister-in-law was arrested for petty theft. She apparently stole diapers and baby formula from a store. My parents were frantic, and they paid her bail. That's when a plan began to form in my mind. I started digging around, finding out exactly how dire her financial situation was. I discovered she had multiple credit card debts, medical bills, and now a criminal charge. She was buried. And that's when I saw my opening for revenge. I'd spent too long nursing my own wounds. It was time to make a decisive move. I looked into legal avenues. I was curious if there was any way to ensure her life became more complicated. Since she'd already broken the law, I contemplated giving an anonymous tip to the authorities about her unstable environment. But I didn't want the baby to suffer unnecessarily, so I had to be careful. Instead, I contacted her landlord, pretending to be a potential employer, verifying her address. That's how I discovered she was months behind on rent. I left a note with management, hinting at her illegal activities and cautioning them about potential property damage. It was but effective. I also spread subtle rumors among former co-workers of hers, implying she was engaged in questionable side gigs. Nothing overtly defamatory, just enough to sow doubt. Word would likely get around to any future employer. I found out she was applying for jobs, so I made anonymous calls to prospective companies, warning them about her recent theft charge. I heard through the grapevine that she was getting rejection after rejection. Meanwhile, she tried to contact my parents for more help, but they were tapped out. She was drowning in her own mess, and I was giving her a gentle push further. Some people might think I was going too far, but every time I questioned myself, I remembered how she and my brother had crushed me. I wasn't putting the baby in danger. I was just ensuring she faced the consequences of her actions. If she'd shown genuine remorse, I might have softened, but everything she did screamed entitlement. From expecting me to finance her life to parading around as though I'd forgive or forget. I wasn't going to let that pass. This was the first time in my life I'd felt truly in control, and I absolutely savored every moment. In the middle of this, my parents tried one final plea. They reached out to my therapist, begging for a family session. My therapist asked if I'd be willing to hear them out. Out of curiosity, I agreed. During the session, they cried, apologized for not supporting me, and insisted they loved me. But then came the same old plea, help your brother's wife for the baby's sake. I reminded them that this was the same woman who cheated with my brother. The same brother who'd betrayed me. I told them I didn't owe them or her a single thing. They called me heartless. My father said I was punishing an innocent child. My mother sobbed that families should stick together. I pointed out that they hadn't stuck by me when I found them in my bed. They hadn't insisted my brother step aside so I could salvage my life. They had essentially forced me to deal with the fallout alone. Now they wanted me to save the day because my brother was gone. That session ended in a shouting match. My therapist told me later that my anger was valid, and I had every right to maintain my stance. A few weeks later, I learned my sister-in-law got evicted. She moved in with a friend who wasn't any better off. I heard from extended family that she started selling her belongings to pay for basic necessities. Meanwhile, I kept making those discreet calls wherever she applied for jobs. I wasn't lying, just highlighting her criminal record and irresponsible behavior. If a company decided she was too risky, that was their choice. I felt no guilt. She'd shown me none when she ruined my life, so I felt none now. That might make me absolutely awful, but I was past caring. Over time, the baby ended up with my parents more often than not. They babysat while my sister-in-law scrambled for money or vanished with questionable friends. My mother kept leaving voicemails begging me to consider adopting my niece. She claimed they were too old to raise a child. I felt sorry for the baby, but I wasn't about to become a parent under these circumstances. Eventually, I found out child services had been alerted by a neighbor. My sister-in-law was investigated. She lashed out at me, accusing me of tipping them off, but I hadn't. They found her neglectful anyway. Not long after, my parents took temporary custody of the baby. They pleaded with me again to step in. I said no. My sister-in-law spiraled further, missing court dates, failing drug tests, and eventually landing back in jail for violating probation. My father confronted me, blaming me for not offering her a lifeline. I told him it wasn't my job to rescue her from her own self-destruction. She had made her choice when she slept with my brother. That was the moment she lost any right to my compassion. He left, calling me unrecognizable, but I felt absolutely nothing else. I soon learned my brother had been spotted in another state, living with some new girlfriend. He was presumably unaware of the chaos he left behind. My parents tried to reach him, but he ignored their calls. Meanwhile, the baby was stuck in limbo, with my parents too old to provide long-term care, and my sister-in-law facing multiple legal issues. None of this changed my decision. I'd built a new life. I started dating again, carefully. I had a supportive network of friends. Whenever guilt crept in, I reminded myself, these were the consequences of their betrayal, not ever mine. Last week, I got a letter from a lawyer representing my parents. They were exploring legal guardianship options, and the document suggested I might be compelled to testify or even consider adoption. I contacted an attorney of my own who explained that while my parents could push for it, I couldn't be forced to adopt my niece. The best they could do was call me as a witness regarding the family situation. That was fine by me. I had nothing to hide. If anything, I was prepared to tell the court detail of how I'd been betrayed and cast aside. I refused to paint a picture. They want to claim family first? Let them hear how my family turned on me. Let them see the consequences of my brother's selfishness and my sister-in-law's betrayal. When the time comes, I'll testify honestly. I won't sugarcoat anything. If this ends with my niece in foster care, I'll feel bad for her, but that's not my responsibility. My father keeps calling, telling me I'm a monster for letting this happen. I told him they made me into who I am now. I'll never forgive what they did. This is their mess to fix. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had forgiven them. But then I recall that horrible image of my fiancé and brother in my bed. I remember the humiliation, the heartbreak, and how they all expected me to just bounce back. That memory fuels me whenever I doubt my choices. It keeps me resolute. I've had enough heartbreak for a lifetime, and none of them showed any concern for my well-being when it mattered. So yes, I'm letting them drown in the consequences. I'm no saint, but I'm not a doormat anymore. I have no intention of backing down. I suppose some will judge me for this stance, but I'd rather be judged than let them walk all over me again. My sister-in-law is the architect of her own misery. She made her bed, pun intended, when she slept with my brother. And he's just as guilty. If he ever comes crawling back, he'll find the door firmly shut. I'm done being the family punching bag. If I sound bitter, maybe I am. But bitterness is a small price to pay for protecting my future. If there's any lesson here, it's that betrayal has a cost, and I'm making them pay. To everyone who believes in quick forgiveness, I'm not your example. I believe some betrayals cut too deep, and the only closure is to let the betrayers face the music. I've been called vengeful, spiteful, and worse, but I sleep well at night, knowing I finally stood up for myself. My ex-fiancé and my brother took everything I held dear. Now I'm simply returning the favor by refusing to help them patch up the damage. Maybe one day I'll meet my niece under better circumstances. But for now, I'm severing every tie. This is ultimately how I choose to heal. So, that's my story, and I'm not looking for approval. I've been through hell, and I chose to respond in the only way that felt right. My brother vanished, my ex-fiancé ended up in ruins, and my parents reaped what they sowed by failing to protect me. If anyone wants a lesson, maybe it's this. Betrayal cuts deepest when it comes from those who claim to love you. There's no rule that says you have to forgive. Sometimes, letting them drown in their own consequences is the greatest justice you can have. That's my truth, and I stand by it.